Exposure. Exposure is the whole essence of photography. It's about capturing the light we see before us and fixing it on film or our digital sensor. Now, our eyes are incredibly good at seeing in near darkness through to bright daylight, but a camera needs a little bit of help with this. The digital sensor or film can only accommodate a narrow band of brightness. And if you let too much light into your camera sensor, then it'll overexpose the image. And at best, it'll be just too bright. At worst, it'll be nearly all white. And if you let in too little light, then the image is underexposed. At best, a little dark. At worst, completely black and murky. The camera also has a dynamic range. What it means is it can only record a certain range of light. Now, again, our eyes, we can see detail in deep shadows on a bright sunny day. But a camera really struggles with this. Too much contrast, too much difference between the light and dark parts of the scene can't be recorded. And this is called dynamic range. You may need to decide when you're taking your picture whether you're going to see details in the shadows or details in the highlights, because you may not get both. You control how much light falls onto the digital sensor through the aperture on your lens and the shutter in your camera. And you can also change how sensitive your digital sensor is by adjusting its ISO setting. And this electronically adjusts how much light is needed to register an image. So, your light is measured by photographers by f-stops. Now, this scale looks a little odd when you see it because the numbers don't quite make sense. But basically, every change upwards in those f-stop numbers means the scene is twice as bright. So your camera actually contains an incredibly accurate and actually incredibly clever light meter that can do all this measuring of brightness for you. The computer in your camera will look at the scene and not only measure the total amount of light, but it can also determine what type of scene. Is it a landscape, a person? And it will adjust the exposure accordingly. So for example, if it recognizes a human head against a bright sky, it knows that you want the face exposed correctly, even if that means the sky is going to be too bright. Now, this computer is nothing like as sophisticated as your eye-brain combination, but it is remarkable how often it gets it right first time. However, if the camera does not match the scene in its library of scene types, then it will normally just try to make an average of all the light and do its best. This exposure metering is called TTL, for through the lens, because it is actually looking at the light being seen by the camera. So you've got ways of controlling how the camera actually meters that light. And there are 4 basic metering modes available to you: evaluative, partial, spot, and center weighted average. Evaluative metering analyzes the whole scene and selects the best exposure based on its library of scenes in its memory. Partial metering bases the exposure that only falls on roughly a 10% circle in the center of the picture. Spot metering, same thing, but it sets the exposure based on the center point, a very small, so 4 or 5% of the center of the picture. And centered weighted average metering, it looks at the whole light around the whole picture, but gives an emphasis again on the light in the center of the picture. Now usually you can use evaluative metering and your camera will get the right exposure most of the time. However, it can be confused by scenes with very dark and very light parts, in which case switching to one of the other modes, usually spot metering, that will let you get the correct exposure for your main subject. How do I know what my camera meter reading is? On the top of your camera, you'll have a small LCD screen which will show you key information about your settings, of which aperture and shutter speed are the most important and show largest in the screen. And you'll also get the same information shown in your viewfinder, usually at the bottom. In this example, on the left, you've got the shutter speed and aperture, and on the right, you have with the ISO and the focus locked indicator. And in the center is the exposure scale, along with an indication of whether the image is considered to be too dark or too bright. Okay, so now you've got an exposure, how do you control it? Well, you can control your exposure by adjusting aperture, shutter speed, or ISO. Aperture controls the size of the diaphragm within the lens to make it larger or smaller. F22 is a very small circle and lets in only a little light. F2 is a large opening and lets in a lot of light. Shutter speed determines for how long the sensor is exposed to light, and it's normally measured in fractions of a second. 1/10 of a second is considered to be quite a slow shutter speed. 1/1000th of a second is quite a fast shutter speed. And ISO determines how sensitive the sensor will be. ISO 100 is a low ISO and is suitable for daylight pictures. ISO 32000 is a very high ISO and is suitable for dark locations. And for each of these settings there is a trade-off. A low aperture, an f2, gives very little depth of field. That means a very narrow range is in focus. A slow shutter speed, 1/10 of a second, it does very little to freeze motion and runs the risk of getting camera shake, the camera moving while you take the picture. And a fast ISO, an ISO 32000, it's pushing the electronics in the camera, so there's more noise, there's more grain in the picture. So you can see you have this sort of exposure triangle, because you can adjust each of these independently, but they also all interact with each other. And to give you some hard numbers, to maintain the same level of exposure as you go from aperture f8 to f5.6, i.e. you're getting brighter, you need to change the shutter speed from 1/200th of a second to 1/100th of a second, i.e. the shutter would be making it get darker. And in this way the two balance out and you get the same exposure. So again, you adjust the exposure to 5.6, all right, that makes your image get brighter. You change the shutter speed from a 200th of a second to 100th of a second, that means the image is getting darker, and the two things balance each other out. So let's take some examples in the real world. We want to take a picture of runners on a sports track and we want to freeze the action. So we want to set a fast shutter speed, 1/500th of a second, and a wide aperture, f5.6. Our focus will need to be spot on and probably only one runner will be sharpened in focus. Or we could take all the runners from front to back, but with some motion blur so we get a sense of speed. So there we'd set a slower shutter speed, 1/50th of a second instead of 1/500th. And we'd have to set quite a small aperture to compensate, something like an f16 instead of f5.6. Or we could keep the fast shutter speed, our 1/500th, and our small aperture, f16, and adjust the ISO from 100 to 800, and that would give us greater sensitivity, but maybe with a bit more noise and reduced quality. Each of these variables is all about balancing the technical needs with your artistic decision. Shooting modes. Remember, your camera is a clever piece of kit. Rather than having to make all those decisions and calculations for every shot yourself, you can let the camera do a lot of the legwork for you. Now, to talk very briefly about camera shooting modes in our general description of the camera. And shooting modes are all about the control of exposure. So automatic basically means the camera is going to make all the decisions for you and come up with an okay but average choice of exposure settings. Aperture priority means you can decide on your aperture setting and the camera will adjust shutter speed to get the correct exposure. Shutter priority is the reverse. Shutter priority means you set the shutter speed and the camera adjusts the aperture. Manual fairly obviously means you are setting both the shutter and the aperture. Now the camera will give you a meter reading so you can see while you're adjusting your settings whether your image is still going to be too bright or too dark. Note though that the camera will rarely adjust ISO settings. This is because changing the ISO can have a significant impact on the quality of your image. So ISO may adjust slightly, but normally only within the ISO 100 to 400 range. It's very limited compared to your camera's actual ISO capability. Your camera will also have special modes, for example portrait, landscape, sports modes. Now all these modes set the camera up so the aperture and shutter speed are more appropriate for that type of shot. So for example, setting sports mode would go for a fast shutter speed to freeze the motion, and at the cost of a wider aperture and a reduced depth of field, the focal range. So for example, when I shoot a wedding, which is a very flexible photo shoot, I'll be changing modes all the time. Let me give you some specifics. When the bride is walking up the aisle, I shoot in shutter priority at 125th of a second. That's because I want to try and freeze the bride and remove any motion blur. When I'm shooting candid shots at the reception, say, I'll often shoot in automatic mode. The moment I need to capture may be so fleeting, and I know the camera will calculate an okay exposure for me. When I'm shooting the formal group shots of all the friends and family, I know I need maximum depth of field, so everybody is in focus. So there I'm in aperture priority mode with a setting of f22. And when I'm shooting more artistic and structured moments, a close-up of the bride or of the wedding rings, I'll use aperture priority with a wide setting, f1.2, to get a really reduced depth of field. So there's just a very sharp focus on say the wedding rings, but everything in the background is out of focus. Then when we get to the evening reception, when things are getting a bit dark, I'll turn the ISO right up from my normal ISO 100 to ISO 3200 or even 6400. And this lets me get images even in darker rooms or outside at night. Understanding your histogram. Your camera will have an option to view a histogram of a picture. This is essentially, it's a graph of the relative amounts of dark to light in the picture. You can usually find this option by selecting the info button when you have a picture displayed on the rear LCD screen. Correctly exposed middle tones are displayed in the center of the graph, dark tones are on the left, bright tones are on the right. And you want to see this graph with either even heights across the chart or with a bit of a peak in the center of the chart. If the chart is bunched too far to the right, then your image will be very bright. And if the chart is bunched too far to the left, then your image will be very dark. Now, if you're taking a photograph of a bride in a white dress, then the histogram will automatically be pushed over to the right because there is a lot of white in the image. But it shouldn't have a really high peak on the right hand edge because that would indicate that it's overexposed. And similarly, if you're taking a picture of the groom in his dark suit, you'd expect an overall shift to the left, but not a high peak on the left hand because that would show that it's underexposed. Now you can use an external light meter, and that was the old school method of measuring light, was to use a handheld device. Really, since the advent of digital cameras, I rarely see photographers using meters anymore. And this is because you can so easily see on the back of your camera the various light levels in your picture and how they relate to each other. The need to meter has pretty much gone away. One last option you may have on your camera is bracketing. Now you can use this if you're unsure of exactly the right exposures you need. And you can set your camera up to take 3 or more photos in quick succession, each at slightly different exposure settings. So normally you'd hope to get one picture slightly underexposed, one picture correctly exposed, and one picture overexposed. But maybe you really do need to see the details in the whites, so actually it's that underexposed image is the one that you're finally going to end up using.